This is meant to be a response video, originally posted as unlisted on YouTube. The idea is to let Aron Ra have a look at it first. If he has any problem with me putting it up as public, then I won't. This is in response to a talk that Aron Ra did with someone going by the name of Virtual Maya recently on YouTube. And that talk, as I understand it, was inspired by or started as a result of a video that Virtual Maya had done. And so I'm going to have a look at that video first, and I will be editing this and just I'm not sure what all I'm going to keep in and what I'm not. This is not scripted. I'm just going to go through the video and make some comments and edit out most of it later so that it won't take up a lot of anybody's time watching it. And then the video of the two of them talking, of course, I plan to do basically the same thing. So let's have a look at that video.
Hello, Virtual Maya here. I'm going to talk about some evolution stuff. One of them is going to be this picture.
It's a work of art. He points out here that that the ears are pointed, which is not normal for humans. I actually was born with pointed ears, by the way. Not that pointed, but pointed nonetheless. And it's not all that rare in humans, but yeah, that's a little extreme. And the artist actually did make them pointed on purpose for just that reason, to make it a little more obvious that it wasn't real, because it wasn't meant to fool anyone.
Which I think is a hoax because, well, look at her pointy ear.
So yeah, not a hoax.
How many humans have a pointy ear like that?
Just a work of art.
Right? And a tail with spinal cord or vertebrae going down it. I don't think this is a real picture.
Nicely done. Well, it's a real picture. Of course, it's a real picture.
Look at the folds of skin there.
A real photograph of a real person
real
with real pointed ears and a real tail. Just the same.
But what really gives it away is I think it's the spinal cord. I don't know if that was supposed to be there, but mainly her ear. So a non-evolutionists see evolution as, say, like fish to amphibian to rodent to monkey to man. But an evolutionist sees evolution as like a change in allele frequency, like skin color. So like a black skin to white skin. That's evolution to them.
Okay, I should clarify this, because evolution is the accumulation of change. Differences, variations, that's not evolution. It comes about through evolution, but variation itself is not evolution. A single change is also not in and of itself evolution. Only when changes accumulate does it count as evolution. If the changes aren't adding up, that's just change. That's not evolution. If something is changing, say for example, cycling through the colors of the rainbow, that's different, because each change is a step on the way towards something else. Now, evolution doesn't have to have goals. It can have. It's not required that it doesn't. Biological evolution doesn't. But even just typing a sentence is evolution. Every letter you add to it is another change. Every punctuation you add to it is another change. But it's the changes adding up that counts as evolution.
Even if humans once have fur, they're still humans, like I showed you here. If this human had fur, and then they turned out not to have fur, they would call that evolution. Well, that's losing an organ.
Yeah, humans with fur are still humans. Losing fur is not evolution. None of it's just, one step losing fur. That's change. Now, if you lose a little bit of fur in one generation, and then the next generation has a little less fur, and the next generation has a little less fur than that, yeah, that's absolutely evolution. The fact that it's losing something doesn't change that. it's still the accumulation of change, even if that change is a loss and not a gain. And in fact, it doesn't have to be a loss or a gain. It simply has to be change that accumulates.
All these right here, this is gaining information and losing information.
Yes, that is gaining and losing information. But he seems to have this idea that it's all about the features, the traits, and it's not. Yes, traits can evolve, but in the case of biological evolution, it's actually the genes that are doing the evolving. The traits are just a result of what genes there happen to be at the time and what environment those genes are in. If you have a gene that mutates and becomes a defective gene that no longer does what that gene used to do, that mutation doesn't necessarily mean a loss of information. If the gene gets deleted, sure, that's a loss of information. But a mutated gene, that's just different information. Now, what nature does with that information, no, that depends on nature. Oh, also, I want to point out, just for anybody that might watch this someday who doesn't know, biological evolution is not linear. In other words, if you have only one offspring, and that one has one offspring, and that one has one offspring, and that one has one offspring, well, sure, then any changes that accumulate in that lineage is going to be entirely linear. But how often does that happen? I mean, more often you have some that have no offspring at all, and some that have only one, and some that have more than one.
Like blue eyes, right? Blue eyes is a mutation.
No, blue eyes are not a mutation. A gene changing from a gene that produces eyes of one color to a gene that produces eyes of another color, yeah.
Still have an eye. Alright, vestigial organs
Yeah,
such as
if you
the
have blue eyes,
appendix.
you still have
You know,
eyes.
I think the appendix is for like gut flora, which is important to our health. But, alright, if you didn't know the purpose of a gallbladder, you wouldn't think you needed it. Like,
moving on.
Here is a pretty good write-up on 29 evidences for macroevolution. Is it 29 evidence? Evidences. I think evidences is correct.
I'm laughing at this because I know about this particular case. The author actually had originally planned to title it 29 Proofs of Evolution. And that was meant as a sort of a way of getting attention because, you know, science doesn't make proofs. It makes theories. That's as close to a proof as science gets. Mathematics makes proofs. Logic makes proofs. Science makes stuff that colloquially can be called proofs, but in the field of science, they avoid using that term. So it's, you know, it was meant as a bit of a joke, and colleagues talked him out of it. So he changed the joke and used evidences, which is something that almost never gets used by anybody but creationists making bad arguments. So I don't know if there was any thought there of maybe they'd be more likely to read it then and learn something, or what exactly. But I do know that was actually meant as humor. If you wanted that to be proper English, you would say 29 pieces of evidence for macroevolution. That would be one way of wording it. It would be a body of evidence containing 29 parts, not 29 evidences. Evidence is not generally considered a countable word in English. Now, myself, I'm all for allowing words to be used any way that a person can get, express themselves and get people to understand them. But still, yeah, this is and 29 evidences was meant as a joke, or 29 plus evidences.
It's a whole bunch of word salad. Well, You'd say that I would say a word salad because I don't understand it. It's
Exactly. Yeah. Not understanding it doesn't make it word salad. Although, yeah, I can understand it might be word salad to the person who can't understand it.
not really comprehensible because it's a lot of writing. I prefer videos and stuff. They make it quick and simple and easy to understand.
And this is why I'm making a video.
Alright, but the main point of this video I want to get through is that the vestigial organs.
Now, I think I've done enough of this particular video here. I think I'll move on to the other one. I could continue on here, but I don't know how much I'm going to be cutting out of what I'm making, and I also don't know if my computer might crash before I'm done filming this, and then I'll have to either start all over or just give up on the idea. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to Aron Ra's video.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of what I think is going to be an addition to the Why Do You Believe series. And in this time I'm talking to Virtual Maya on YouTube, and he appears to be, and I've described him this way to him, so he seems to be okay with that. I called him a Runaway Skeptic, because he seems to be skeptical about everything. Says he's an atheist, he just doesn't believe in evolution or anything else, so far as I can tell. Alright, so is that a fair assessment of your position?
I think it's ambiguous.
Okay. Alright, so
Now, I wonder what did he mean there, it's ambiguous. I mean, he was basically just asked if that was a fair assessment. Was it or wasn't it? Yeah.
Let me preface this by putting myself in the same position you are as much as I can. I am not a fan of Big Bang cosmology.
Oh.
I've talked to a lot. I've talked to a number of, some of the leading physicists and cosmologists and so forth. And part of the reason that I am not a fan of the Big Bang is first of all that I don't understand it, but at least on my side of that, I mean, I've talked to some of the best people on it, and I get the impression that nobody really understands it, at least not very well. And to put that into perspective, I can't prove that the Big Bang is, how well substantiated the Big Bang is, like I can for evolution. Evolution I got down. I know evolution well enough that I can definitely prove it, but I can't do that for the Big Bang. And it may be because it's above my head, but it also may be that it's not actually true so far as I can tell. But I can't deny that just outright and say, well, I don't believe that because I don't have anything to put in its place.
I think I understand the Big Bang pretty well, for somebody who isn't, a scientist in that field. But I also have a bit of a problem with it, though, and that is the fact that a lot of the math involved sort of relies on the idea that observed redshift and blue shift are indications of a Doppler effect, a Doppler shift going on, and I would expect that some of it is because Einstein's general theory of relativity seems to indicate that space can warp and bend, and that sort of thing would make sense. But at the same time, higher frequency light, higher frequency electromagnetic radiation carries more energy than lower frequency. Longer wavelengths or lower frequencies carry less energy. And so there is the question of, as light redshifts and arrives at its destination with less energy than it had when it left, where did that energy go? The fact that it's stretched out, if that's all it is the wavelength got stretched, that shouldn't end up with less energy. Now, I suppose one way of looking at that is it's the same amount of energy spread out over more time. But the fact that photons are detected as a quantum, basically all or nothing, it seems to be that time shouldn't be a factor in that sense. That, you know, there isn't any range of time over which a photon is being detected. It's either detected or it's not. And so I've wondered if, you know, there might be something else involved, that photons might actually be losing some energy on their way through basically empty space. Maybe something to do with particles that get in the way, things that, you know, having to go around a lot of hydrogen atoms, or whatever the case might be. But there again, in that sense, it gets to a point where I don't fully understand what's going on, and there's only so much I can say about it. But like Aron Ra, I can definitely say that evolution is a real thing. Evolution happens all the time. Pretty much everything evolves. Literally everything that accumulates change evolves. That means religions evolve, cultures evolve, societies evolve, languages evolve, and of course, life evolves.
Yeah, science is about finding models that work, not necessarily truth.
The truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true.
I would go as far as to say that science is interested in finding the truth. But yes, part of doing that is finding models that work. And a lot of why science is done is to find ways of being able to improve the life that humans get to live. To be able to have a little more control over our surroundings. So there's more than one facet to it. I definitely wouldn't say that science is not about finding the truth, although that's obviously not all it's about.
Like a black box or a clear box, right? It's all pretty much a black box. We don't know what's in there, but we know the facts that surround it. As opposed to a clear box, we can see right through to the center.
Yeah, and there are an awful lot of scientific experiments that anybody can do right in their own home. Yeah, okay, black box. If you're talking about CERN, for example, you're talking about a nuclear particle accelerator. Yeah, most people don't go building their own particle accelerator, and even if they did, they're not going to get one as big as the large ones that are making the the biggest discoveries. But those are sort of fringe areas of science. I mean, those are areas that, yeah, the average person can't really, get into doing the experiments themselves, but they're also very, very well documented experiments. So it's not really a black box in that sense. A lot of that documentation is available to the public. It's just a matter of finding it. It's kind of like, the human genome is available to the public. You want to look at it, it's out there to look at. No big mystery.
Creationists who deny microevolution, who don't even understand how different breeds of dogs came about. They don't even accept evolution at that level, and I don't know what kind of reality denial you have to do. I think you're on the level of a flat earther when you get to that level of denial. But most of the time, creationists will accept the mechanisms of evolution. They just don't understand, or they don't accept how far they go. So they'll accept microevolution, and then they try to make some arbitrary division so that they don't accept macroevolution anymore. So they'll accept that all breeds of dogs are derived from Asiatic wolves, for example. They'll accept all the genetic data and all of that to show how those are derived. But at some point, it begins to challenge their religious beliefs, and so they put up a mental block. And so they say that the taxonomy only works up to a point. Now, Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis says he'll move that point wherever he needs to, whenever he wants, just to suit his belief. So that sometimes the division between micro and macro in his mind is between species as it would normally be, and as according to most of the intelligent design people, like Phil Johnson, for example, said that it was at the species level, and that's actually where it should be, according to what most of these people say. But Ken Ham moves it all over the place. Sometimes he says macroevolution is at the genus level, and sometimes, like in the case of elephants, for example, he puts it at the family level, but never accepts that humans are within the family of apes, because there's just a contradiction there, and so he's not going to accept that fact. But if they're going to accept that the taxonomic tree works at all up to a point, then they have to show where is that point. Where do you have the beginning of a created kind?
Basically, the node on the evolutionary tree at which supposedly some specific life form was created according to a particular set of creation beliefs. And I've noticed that creationists seem to be really vague about just where those points are. And understandably, they tend to admit they don't know, but yet they insist that there has to be such a point, and I think that's sort of dishonest to insist that there has to be such a point when they can't even identify one such point, and I think that's kind of Aron's point.
Do you accept the word kind? Like, would you say there are many kinds of apes?
No, there's no definition of a kind. There literally is no such thing as a biological kind.
Well, I know, but would you say there's many kinds of fish? There's many kinds of
Well, that
dogs?
depends on what you mean by the word. Now, creationists will describe a kind as something that was created by God. They use exactly the same definition of a kind that I would use for a clade, except that instead of the clade being nested in a parent clade, they say that a kind is specially created by God out of nothing.
Something I like to do with language in that respect is to clarify things with qualifying words, with descriptive words. For example, in this case, what is being talked about here as a particular kind that was supposedly created by some creator, I would call that a created kind, to distinguish it from just a kind in any other sense of the word. I'd go along with Virtual Maya on this idea. Yeah, there are different kinds of fish. There are different kinds of dogs. There are different kinds of vertebrates. Dogs and fish are different kinds of vertebrates. Which, if you want to go back to the created kind thing, that raises a big question. Yeah, dogs and fish are both different kinds of vertebrates, which means they're different kinds in that sense. But they're also both the vertebrate kind, as opposed to invertebrates, which are a different kind than vertebrates. So then the real question is, somebody who thinks their God created specific kinds of animals or of life forms, do they think their God created the vertebrate kind and the invertebrate kind as two separate kinds? And if so, then why do the vertebrates seem to have evolved from the invertebrates?
So there can't be a parent category, except that there's a contradiction even then, because the Bible talks about all different kinds of birds. So we have multiple kinds of birds, and then it also says there are multiple sorts of birds. So what is a kind and what is a sort? The Bible doesn't say either way, but we know that all of them are birds, so why isn't bird a kind? Well, because God didn't make just one kind of bird. He made a bunch of different kinds of birds. Well, why would he do that? Why would God make a bunch of things that look exactly the same, or that have all the indications that they are related to a single common ancestor?
there is a mention in a part of the Noah's Ark story of a couple of different birds being sent out basically to, see if there's land out there, because it seems God was giving Noah the silent treatment and wasn't talking to him anymore when it came time to, find out there was land. He couldn't just ask God, hey, is there any land out there yet? But different kinds of birds were sent out. So anybody who wants to try to reduce it down to saying, well, there was one bird kind, and that the one kind of bird is all that was brought on the ark, so there wasn't really need for room for more than one kind of bird. Well, at the very least, there was more than one kind of bird, according to the story. Just saying.
And then that common ancestor should be a dinosaur. So where does that put the other men are after in dinosaurs in the biblical concept of kinds? Where do they fit?
So the difference between kind and clades is clades have a common ancestor for everything, but kinds limit their common ancestry to...
No, in neither case. It's pronounced clades.
Oh, clades.
But clade includes all of it. It's a category that includes all of its descendants. So humans, for example, are a clade no matter if you have all of the criteria to be a human, okay, fine. But if you're born for whatever reason without 2 arms or 2 legs at all, and all of the criteria like that, you'd still be a human because you're descended of humans, so you still belong to humans. Does that make sense? Even if you're different now, and even if you have a new species that is different, even if you have extra stuff that your parents don't have, you're still going to belong to every clade that your ancestors did. Now, the creationist concept of kind is the same thing, that it would include all of the descendants. So they want there to be a dog kind, right? So you can have every kind of dog ever imaginable, and it doesn't matter how much they evolve, even to the point where they don't even look like dogs anymore, they're still going to be classified as dogs. But the difference is that the created kind begins with an act of God. So they're poofed out of nothing.
I don't know what the creationist definition of kinds is, but I do accept the word kinds. There's a general kind, which is like a bird, reptile, mammal. It's pretty arbitrary. But
the dog kind, if you want to use that, all descendants of the dog kind are going to be of the dog kind. If you call that a dog clade, then you still have the same thing, that all descendants of the dog clade are going to be in the dog clade. However, the dog clade descended from ancestors of the dog clade that were not necessarily dogs. And there's where I think there's a little difficulty in understanding coming along, because he seemed to be having some difficulty with the concept of the difference between descendants and ancestors. That, to recognize, for example, that ancestors don't come after the descendants.
We have genomic sequence analysis comparisons to show the origin for all cats. This is panthers and felines. And they emerge from what is the oldest, considered to be the oldest and most primitive cat in the world, I think, is the clouded leopard in Asia. And the clouded leopard also has the longest fangs proportionate of any cat species. And these are the closest link to the Machaerodonts, which is another form of cat that we don't have anymore. And those are called the Scimitar Cats. And a lot of people will think about the saber-toothed tiger, which of course is not a tiger. There was actually a whole lineage of cats, very distinctly different than any cat we have now. They were much more bear-like in some respects. They were like heavy, stout animals, not the lithe, springy things that are like today's felines and panthers are. But the Smilodons, or the Scimitar Cats, there was a wide range of them and a wide range of sizes. And of course, the Smilodon is just the biggest one. And they have genetic links indicate, we don't think we have any DNA for Machaerodonts, but all of the existing cats go down to this one, which is morphologically similar to some of the Machaerodonts, so that would be the link.
all right, so I need to watch that video. I can't believe I haven't watched it before. I watch a lot of your videos, many times over and over. But whether or not all felines have a common ancestor or not, my argument is that it's going to be a feline, no matter how far back you go. You'll always be able to recognize it as a feline.
He's saying no matter how far back you go, it's always going to be a feline. Well, if you're only following the felines back as far as you can, then yeah, of course, that's always going to be a feline because you've defined it that way. But if you're following the ancestors of felines back, you will reach a point where the ancestors of felines are no longer felines. Going forward, the descendants of felines will always be felines. But the ancestors of felines, if you go back far enough, are not felines. And that's something that I think he's kind of missing there.
That you can never outgrow your ancestry.
So we did.
Well, never once have we done that. No.
Well, we're not fish no more, though.
Right, because the word fish isn't a taxonomic classification. They've used the word chordate.
Now, I want to stop and try to clarify something here that I think a lot of people don't realize is the case. The first chordate would not have been... I'm trying to think how to put this. At the time that the first chordate was alive, it would not have been a new genus or a new family or a new phylum. It probably wouldn't have even been a new species. It would have just been a new variety. Some existing species at that time that would have been a species at that time had a variation that had a spinal cord. Any particular feature that you want to throw in there, you can substitute that with, for example, the vertebrate.
A chordate is not tangible.
Why not?
Because you can't evolve from a spinal cord. You gotta have an actual animal.
Nobody evolved. No, chordates don't evolve from a spinal cord.
I'm saying it's a label. It's not an actual
animal. It's a
animal.
label for an animal that has a spinal cord.
So we didn't evolve from a spinal cord. We evolved from a specific
animal that had a spinal cord, which of course evolved from animals that didn't yet have spinal cords. They were notochords, which were precursors to spinal cords. And then when you have spinal cords later, we end up with calcium deposits along those spinal cords, which are then segmented to allow movement. And this is called vertebrae. And then at that point, we become vertebrates.
The first animal with vertebra, again, would have been just a variation at that time. But its descendants, as they diversified, would have eventually had variations of their own. And the collection of all of those variations, when it diverged far enough from other lineages from those same ancestors, would have been eventually something that we would have considered its own species. And of course, by now, those that didn't go extinct have had plenty more time to diversify into many species, and they're farther up branches on the tree. It's kind of like if you look at the actual growth of a physical biological tree, as opposed to like the tree of evolution, you start out really with a single sprout that has one stem. Can't really properly call it a branch at that point because there's no branching going on, but it's just like a branch, the very end of a branch. And when that splits and you do actually get some branching going on, of course, right near that stem, you've got, again, branches that are like the end of a branch. But as they continue to divide out into more and more and more branches, eventually, what was the original branch or stem becomes the trunk of the tree. and where you had, every place where the tree splits off into a two or three more branches, that was a place that had been the end of a branch at one point in time and probably grew leaves on the end of that branch. But when the tree is older, there's thick bark there. There's no more leaves growing on it. It's not the same. It's not in the same context anymore. We humans are a subspecies of Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens being a species of the genus Homo, which is humans. That genus would have been a species at one time, and before that would have been just a variety of an earlier species. So I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but I'm trying to.
In the systematic classification of life series, I go through the whole chain. We are still Sarcopterygians, and we're still chordates, and we're still vertebrates. We never stopped being everything that our ancestors were.
Yeah, we are eukaryotes.
Yes.
It doesn't mean we evolved from single-cell eukaryotes.
Well, we have to.
Animals. Doesn't mean we evolved from.
But we have to. Every organism. Yeah, but there's a parallel between evolutionary development and embryological development, and it's inarguable that we all begin from a single cell.
Like during conception?
Exactly.
And we're equivocating that to
equivocation. Equivocation is a logical fallacy where you use two different definitions interchangeably in order to confuse your opponent.
I'm just saying you got conception and you got single cell organism evolving into pretty much micro to man evolution to conception to adult. I just see like you're equivocating growing.
This is an area that confuses a lot of people, but yes, growing is evolution. It is not evolution of a population. It's evolution of the thing that's growing. And yes, an individual human being starts out as a single-celled eukaryote and evolves into an embryo, a fetus, a baby, a toddler, a child, an adult, a senior citizen, and eventually a corpse. This is the evolution of the individual. That's of course not inherited, but it is still evolution. It is still an accumulation of change. It's there's no need for random mutations or anything like that for that evolution to happen, because that's all pretty much programmed into the DNA, with a little room for the environment to, of course, manipulate that somewhat. But yes, that definitely is evolution. Now, there is a strong point to be made in the fact that since it is demonstrable that a single-celled organism, namely a fertilized human egg, can evolve into an adult human, surviving at every step along the way within the individual lifetime of one human, that individual life form's evolution from a single-celled eukaryote to a multi-celled adult human eukaryote. That it was a human, of course, when it was single-celled as well, but that very much demonstrates that it is not impossible for every step along the way from single-celled to adult human to be something that can survive. Now, that doesn't mean that adults of our ancestors looked like embryonic humans. They went through different stages. But those stages also were survivable, or we wouldn't be here.
I'm not equivocating, as I just explained. Equivocation means something different than the way you're using it.
Oh.
But I'm saying that there's a parallel we can prove evolution regardless. Even if there was a God who poofed the first life form into existence, we can still prove that it evolved since then. So it literally has no bearing on it at all.
Well,
but
it kind of does. That's
how? Why?
Because you need a precursor for evolution. It's
okay,
a precursor.
Let's look at it this way. I've used this analogy since I was a little kid. Let's say you're watching the dominoes, the domino effect. You've got all these dominoes, this massive room full of dominoes, and the dominoes are falling. You slow down your camera so that you can barely detect movement. You may have to, it's in such a slow motion that you might have to leave the room and come back and realize that this thing has moved, because you can't actually see it move with the trick of your own eye. You can determine by the past dominoes that have fallen and the ones that are still standing, and by detecting the movement of the one that's still in action, you can prove that those dominoes are falling. And then somebody comes along and says, well, how did the first one fall? I don't know. Well, if you don't know how the first one fell, then you don't know that this one's falling. But that's ridiculous. That could have been knocked over by the wind. It could have been pushed over by a finger. It doesn't matter. This one is falling. These dominoes are still falling regardless how the first one fell. Do you understand that?
What if there wasn't a first one? What if life always existed? And by definition of life, I'm not saying necessarily biological life. I'm saying consciousness.
What is there?
What?
Well, I have to go with the biological definition, the 7th grade biological definition of the 7 criteria that you have in order to be considered alive. And that you have to be replicative, that you have to grow, that you have to have homeostasis, which is a balanced internal chemical environment, which is why viruses don't count as alive, because they don't meet that criteria. And they don't grow. And another one is that you have to evolve. That's actually one of the definitions of life. But it's always biological. Life is an aspect of biochemistry.
I'm going to disagree here, only because, the word life gets used for an awful lot outside of biology as well. And I think at least some of those uses have to be valid. There is, for example, artificial life, which is a sort of a field of computation. There is, of course, there are phrases like the life of the party and things like that, which have a different sort of usage of life, but nonetheless, there's still some meaning shared in common. I will go as far as to say that if you're talking about a life form, of course, the life of the party doesn't really, seem to fit the description of a life form. It's a different usage of life in that sense. So, but as far as what he was saying about, I think he was saying something about souls or the mind or something. We have no evidence of that being its own life form. If it was, so what? There again, we're back to the same thing, that evolution is still happening regardless. And if the first life form started by some miracle or some disembodied mind or whatever the case might be, that wouldn't change the fact that we're still evolving.
So when you talk about life always existing before there was a planet to exist on, or before that doesn't make sense. It's got to be the biological process.
Well, I would say that there could be, just for sake of time, different types of life. For example, disembodied life. You don't need DNA to be alive. You're just consciousness disembodied.
Then,
well, if you're playing Pac-Man, your Pac-Man character can have 3 or 5 lives depending on how the game is set up and how many extra lives you've earned. But those aren't going to, at any time in their existence, produce biological offspring. It's just not going to happen.
Then it's not life. Life is based on the basis of cells, cell biology, or cell.
Well, there's biological life, and then there's another definition of life. Just like evolution could have different definition.
Evolution is the accumulation of change.
What is another definition of life? And I'd like to look up, because you told me before that you only go with logic and science. So give me the logic and science that implies another kind of life that isn't biochemical.
I'd say disembodied consciousness.
Where do we ever find science? Do we need to amend your note where you said that you only go by logic and science and actual science, not pseudoscience? Because you did.
Let's see. If I just open up another tab here and type in define life, let's see what Google says. Not sure where it'll pick it from, but just something to start with. Here, 1. The condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death. Number 2, the existence of an individual human being or animal. Okay, and so that second one is life, as in like the lifespan of something, which could be applied, for example, to the life of a battery or the life of a automobile, meaning how long is it expected to be functional. This first one, the condition that distinguishes animals or plants from inorganic matter, is in a sense sort of the same one that's used to describe life of other kinds, like artificial life, or the life of a video game character. Not the lifespan of a video game character, of course, that falls under the second one. But it mentions, for example, the capacity for growth. Well, of course, your Pac-Man character, well, okay, so Super Pac-Man got these little things it can swallow and grow, and then later it'll shrink back down. But generally speaking, your Pac-Man character isn't going to grow. It's also not going to reproduce. Functional activity? Yeah, it's got that. And artificial life also has functional activity. Conway's Game of Life produces functional activity. That's a particular well-known cellular automaton. And continual change preceding death. Well, there again, I think that's pretty much key to what distinguishes life from non-life right there. That it's the continual change. And as long as that continual change keeps happening, and of course preceding death sort of being a key point, because death is sort of defined as the end of life. That you could count other things besides biology as being alive in that sense, but a disembodied mind, or a supernatural soul or spirit, things that we don't have any evidence even exist. We would have to find one first and analyze its properties before we could decide if it was alive.
See, evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population over time, given no genetic barrier.
Evolution is the accumulation of change.
I'm saying evolution doesn't exist. All it is variety propagation within a population, a specific.
So variation of allele frequencies doesn't exist?
Okay, variety propagation. That would not be evolution. If he's just talking about variety being propagated, that there's no change being accumulated there. But variety isn't just propagated. Variety is also developed. There is new variety that comes about in biological evolution over time. As biology reproduces, as biological life forms reproduce, mutations happen. Some of those mutations survive. That adds to the diversity and the variety within a population. And yes, if that variety survives, it will tend to be propagated. But the propagating of the variety is not evolution. So if he's thinking there's no such thing as evolution because he thinks evolution is just propagation of variety, well, yeah, I'm not sure what he's thinking there. It's not making a lot of sense to me. But evolution is the accumulation of change, not the propagation of variety.
Yes, but there are genetic templates somewhere, which if the DNA...
Can you show me one of these, because that's the phylogeny challenge. Show me the genetic template that isn't related to sister templates or part of a parent category.
So, humans make humans. You've heard that from Ken Hovind and you guys, right? And it works in the evolution model. Humans make humans too in the evolution model. But the only difference is...
It only works in the evolution model. I mean, creationists are just using that part of the evolution model.
If we look at the present, yeah, humans make humans, apes make apes. Humans are apes, so therefore apes make humans. But not all apes make humans. Only human apes make humans in the present. But if you go into the past, humans made humans. Apes made apes. Human apes made humans. Non-human apes made humans. Once. That's all it took. Once. And we are descendants of that. Now that doesn't mean that there was some very non-human ape that made a completely human offspring. It's not how it works. If you could make a minimum definition of what it takes to qualify as human, if you specified every single last detail that was absolutely necessary to qualify as the first human, chances are those features were out there amongst different members of the population before they all managed to get together into one human. So it wasn't a matter of that one non-human lacking a few dozen human traits suddenly had an offspring with all of those traits. It's more like two parents got together that had all the human traits they needed to make a human offspring, but the parents themselves weren't quite human. Close enough to it that you could probably call them human without anybody throwing a big fit over it. Well, some people would anyway. But the point is, they would have been very close to human. But not quite. But the offspring of their offspring wouldn't necessarily have quite fit that exact definition of human either. Because again, these are traits going around a population. Somewhere along the way, you ended up with a population of humans, as opposed to a population of almost humans. That almost humans would have been its own species. And the almost that species would have been its own species. And the almost that species would have been its own species. All the way back to when eukaryotes were a single species. I would say maybe even farther back than that, except for the fact that eukaryotes seem to have developed from a bit of endosymbiosis. And so there we kind of have to draw a line. There was a different process that went on. And when you get down to abiogenesis, yeah, there's a form of evolution involved in that also, but it's, again, a different process. Possibly several different processes.
Okay, so I would argue that a cat has always been a cat and always will be a cat.
Yes, a cat has always been a cat and until it dies and becomes, a cat corpse and rots away, it'll always be a cat. And chances are its parents were cats as well, and its descendants will definitely be cats. But what kind of cat? And there we get back to the kind thing. What variety of cat? And will some variety of cat that descends from that cat eventually be a different species of cat than any other species of cat that was around before? That's how speciation works. That's how evolution works. Specifically, that's how biological evolution works. Yeah, of course, they're always going to be cats. But if you go back to their ancestors, no, those weren't always cats. You go back far enough, they were feliforms, not necessarily cats. You go back farther than that, and they were carnivora, but not necessarily cats or feliforms. You go back farther than that, they were mammals, not necessarily carnivora. If you go back farther than that, they were vertebrates, not necessarily mammals. This is how evolution works. Now, if some descendant of a vertebrate doesn't have vertebra, doesn't have a spine, they're still in the clade vertebrata. They might not be considered vertebrate in sort of the colloquial sense. They might not be considered a vertebrate in the sense of distinguishing between a vertebrate and an invertebrate. But they would still be in the clade vertebrata because that is their ancestry. In the same sense, a descendant of carnivora doesn't have to be a carnivore. They can be an herbivore, but they're still going to be in the clade carnivora. You might say they're carnivorans, even if they're not necessarily carnivores.
Okay. So you're saying that I'm saying there's variations within the cat, and you've heard this before.
There are variations within feliforms, yes.
But yes. Okay, so you admit the varieties happen.
I don't just admit it, that's what evolution is.
Varieties exist. Variation happens. Yeah. Variation happening is a result of evolution. Again, evolution is the accumulation of change, whether you're talking biological or otherwise. But variety doesn't happen. It just is. If that makes any sense. Evolution happens.
It's a theory of biodiversity, which means
show me an example?
variation.
Can you show an example of a variation resulting in a new kind?
There's no such thing as a kind, so I can't show you an example of something there's no such thing as.
I can. Again, I understand, Aron, if you're listening to this, I understand that you're talking about kind in the creationist sense. And yeah, I can't prove that either. But I can answer his question. He wants a case of a variety that produced a new kind. Yeah, pick any variety you want. If you want to use kind in the colloquial sense, then we could say, well, if you have, say, for example, an animal that has blue eyes, and none of its ancestors had blue eyes. Well, some of its descendants may then end up having blue eyes, and you can distinguish the kind that has blue eyes from the kind that doesn't have blue eyes. It's a new kind. I think that's perfectly valid. Now, is it a new created kind? No. It's a new evolved kind.
A kind is a colloquial term such as an iguana, a crow, a rat. Those are kinds.
That would be examples of different animals. Different kinds of animals in that sense, yeah. Also different kinds of life forms. An iguana isn't a kind of mammal. It isn't a kind of bird. It's a kind of something. It's a kind of several different things. This is where it gets a little vague. But if you want to say that there were limits to how far back you can take the ancestry, then what was the first ancestor of an iguana? The thing is, the fossil records should show the answer to that question. There should be a farthest back fossil ancestor of iguanas, or of any other life form. But that's not what we find. We find a continuous fossil record with a few small gaps in it in various places, but only because fossilization is rare, and no large enough gaps to be able to say this is the base of some created kind. It just doesn't happen.
No, they're not, because they're not defined.
I just defined it.
No, you didn't. You said it's a colloquial category, which is too broad. It doesn't matter. So with each one of these, you have parent categories that these all belong to. These are not kinds. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to go against the evolutionary law of monophily, where something stops being what it was to become something else. And even if you become, every level of evolution is just a modified version of whatever its ancestors are. Another summary definition of evolution is descent with inherent genetic modification. So you have a prior form, and the descendants are modified in that prior form, and they may be modified many different ways. So like,
all you do is take smaller animals and line them up.
I'm sorry, what?
So all you really did was just take smaller animals like bacteria and work it up.
Bacteria are not animals.
I know they're not.
Get started.
I think this is going back to the what do they call it? The ladder of, I forget what the name of that was, but the linear form. The idea that life evolved along a single line. I think he's going back to like those old pictures of like several different kinds of primates, starting from ones that are small and crawling on the ground, and progressing to ones that are larger and standing on 2 feet, with hunching over on the way as if that was a comfortable position for somebody. I get what he's saying, how to address that. It's not just a matter of lining things up and saying, hey, this is similar to that, and that's similar to that, and that's similar to that. There's a heck of a lot more that's going on. Of course, Aron knows this very, very well. There are a lot of details that go into the classification of a particular life form. And the descendants of that life form carry on the genes from their ancestors with some modifications. But the genes that get carried on are inherited, and the traits that come from those genes are inherited. It's not just a matter of these things are similar. It's a matter of what things have been inherited, and you can tell that by which similarities there are. And I think that's another thing that's kind of important to note, that it's not just a matter of how many similarities there are, but which similarities there are. Because when a particular similarity gets lost in a lineage, it's gone. Yeah, you might eventually evolve back something very much like it, but you'll never get back what's lost. It's just gone. Because if the genes aren't there to produce that particular similarity anymore, then it's not going to be produced. Now, you might have a population that has some that have it and some that don't, but when that particular feature dies off in a population and there's nothing left in that population with the genes to produce that feature, nothing left that can breed with that population that carries the genes to produce that feature is gone. And sure, you might have an occasional atavism, organ shows up, a limb shows up or something that all the genes are still there for it, but maybe just got switched off, and maybe a mutation switches them back on. But when the genes for the particular feature are actually gone, they're gone. And they're not coming back.
Okay, so why do you say smaller animals like bacteria? Why?
I just said organism. You took smaller organisms, and you took all the ones on Earth, and you said this one would be next, this one would be next, this one would be next. And
No. It's not like that at all.
In a simple way, it is.
No, not even a simple way. 300 years ago, Carolus Linnaeus began to categorize life forms as a creationist, and he was expecting to find evidence of created kinds. But what he found instead was a nested hierarchy of different taxonomic clades. What he didn't recognize them as clades, he calls them different ranks. But why would there be a set of daughter groups within every parent group, and then every parent group belongs to a parent group itself, and there's also has siblings in those parent groups, every one of them. So he discovered a branching tree pattern which did not make sense.
But nobody's connecting those lines to those branching.
Nobody what?
But drawing those lines between those trees.
They're not lines between trees, they're categories.
So because bears have eyes and I have eyes, in a simple sense, you're saying they're related.
Virtual Maya, you don't have bear eyes. You have primate eyes. You have human eyes, which are a type of primate eyes. You have ape eyes, which are a type of primate eyes. Human eyes are a type of ape eyes. Eyes evolve. Bear eyes and human eyes have a lot in common because they're both mammal eyes, and they inherited a lot of their features from earlier mammals. But human eyes and bear eyes are also different. And human eyes did not inherit any features from bear eyes, and bear eyes did not inherit any features from human eyes. And that's important to understand, because it's not just a matter of that they share some features in common. It's a matter of what features they share in common and what features they don't share in common, and how that relates to their ancestry, because their ancestors would have shared most of the same features in common. And the farther back you go, the less in common it is between that far back one and the modern one. But the more of what is in common is also going to be in common with the other branch. In other words, that the things that earlier ancestors of humans have in common, early ancestors of bears are much more likely to have in common as well. And it's not just, again, it's not just a matter of the probability. There are specific dividing points. There are specific points where these features come in and stay in, or go away and stay away. You've got to look at the evidence if you really want to understand it. But evolution itself is just the accumulation of change. If you can see that change can accumulate, then you know that evolution can and does happen. And if you think there's got to be some point going back in time at which evolution could not have happened, well, then you have to find a place where that would actually make sense. And yeah, biological evolution, biological life evolving, you can only go back as far in time as there was biological life. That would be the cutoff point. Other things evolved up to the point of having biological life happen, but the evolution of biological life requires biological life. Evolution of biochemistry into biological life does not require biological life. It requires biochemistry. And the evolution of chemistry into biochemistry doesn't require biochemistry. It just requires chemistry. The evolution of physics into chemistry doesn't require chemistry. It just requires physics.
Because bears are mammals, and you're a mammal. Are you not a mammal? So the category of mammal includes the category of mammal includes both bears and humans, right?
The category, but you could also say mammal kind. We are the same.
I could use nonsense words if I wanted to, but let's stick with something that makes a little bit more sense.
Kind works.
No, it doesn't, because kind has an implication. Kind has an implication that it doesn't have an ancestor.
I want to address this, what he's saying about mammal kind, that kind works in that sense. Because, okay, if you're going to say there's a mammal kind, and you're also going to say there's a bear kind and a human kind, then since mammals includes humans and bears, that would mean that the bear kind and the human kind are part of the mammal kind. Seems we've gotten right back to clades. Because if humans were specially created as a kind, and bears were especially created as a kind, and mammals were specially created as a kind, then why did humans and bears have to be created as a kind when they're already the mammal kind? If the mammal kind was specially created, then there was no need to create the bear kind and the human kind, because they could have come from the mammal kind. Because they are the mammal kind. In fact, in order to be the mammal kind, they had to have come from the mammal kind. Because again, we're back to clades. And if you want to take that far enough back, eventually you'll get to the point where if you want to try to say that a creator created some special kinds, they're basically down to creating bacteria and archaea. That's pretty much it.
Humans and bears are both in the mammal category, right?
Okay, they could or could not have a common ancestor.
But it doesn't matter. We are in the same category in that respect, and when you look at the
category doesn't mean common ancestor.
Look at the priority in either case, and then compare that to the fossil record, then you start seeing things where you don't just have a matchup of the morphology, but then you have the map up in the chronology and paleontology as well. And then when you map up genetics, then you get another overlap that's again telling the same story. So you have multiple lines of evidence all drawing the same conclusion, universally, consistently.
Okay. So you said that DNA means we're related.
DNA does mean we're related, yes, because there's a list or a suite of different ways of comparing genomes that indicate relatedness on specific, unique markers, but we don't need to get into that right now.
Okay, I'm just saying DNA is ambiguous.
No, DNA is not ambiguous. Yeah, you can use it ambiguously, but no, DNA is not ambiguous. DNA is very, 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 very extremely specific. You have very specific DNA. That is not the same as my very specific DNA. Shares certain things in common, sure, The things that we share in common in our DNA is what defines us as human. Chimpanzees have a lot of things in common with us as well in their DNA. The things that chimpanzees share in common in their DNA with other chimpanzees would be what defines them genetically as a chimpanzee. The things that chimpanzees share in common with humans in their DNA define humans and chimpanzees as very closely related, because we share those things in common that came from our common ancestor.
It could mean common design. It could mean...
No, it can't.
Okay.
No, it really can't, because DNA. There's a number of presentations that show how DNA fails a designer model. The fact that 8% of our DNA is made of endogenous retroviruses, for example, or the viral DNA.
I could disprove viruses in the first place, but that's...
I'm sorry, what?
I could disprove viruses in the
Actually,
first place.
you can't. I showed you a scientific paper showing a number of photographs about viruses, and I asked you to explain to me what these are, and then also to explain why it is that we have all these people that doctors and such that can treat illnesses stemming from these, why their medicines work, and why we have these huge research facilities studying these things that anybody can see with a microscope.
Well, let's take it a step farther than that, because a virus has a DNA or RNA sequence depending on the kind of virus, and that DNA or RNA sequence can be sequenced. In other words, the sequence can be read off and recorded, and can also be manipulated. And experiments have been done with manipulating virus DNA or virus RNA or both. And also endogenous retroviruses inside of the human genome or the cow genome or the chimpanzee genome or bear genome or any other genome match the sequence of the virus that they came from, which is why they're known to be viruses, because you can recognize the sequence. Maybe a couple of mutations here and there, but there again, those are trackable also. You can trace the mutations back over an ancestry, and these mutations are inherited when they happen. A virus that infects a cell and manages to reproduce itself generally will end up killing that cell. But a virus that infects a cell and manages to embed itself into the DNA in such a way that it sort of becomes innocuous, doesn't really do anything to the cell, will still get replicated because it's now part of the cell's DNA. If that happens to be in a cell that's in the lineage that leads to an offspring, then that offspring not only inherits that virus, but inherits that virus in every single one of their cells, all in a place where it's not doing any harm. And exactly where that virus is inherited by their offspring. Any mutations that happen, any small changes that happen along the way, those small changes are also inherited by offspring, by descendants. I don't know why this is really so hard for some people to understand. If you start with a sequence of random letters, and you copy that sequence of random letters over and over and over and over, but you don't copy the original one. You copy the last one over and over and over, always copying the last one. If you make a mistake, whether on purpose or on accident, if you change a letter and then you continue to copy with that change, that's going to show up in the list. That's what mutations do. They get inherited. And those changes show up in the ancestry. It's really not that hard.
Yeah, that would
be disprove viruses.
That would be digressing. We could talk about that in another show. You probably won't want to.
What you said when I showed you that, I showed you those pictures and I asked you, what is that? And can you explain why the medicine works and what is this great conspiracy to create the lie of viruses that anybody can see with a microscope? And you said you weren't even going to contest that.
Well, you can't see viruses with a microscope.
You can.
They're too small.
You can, and it has been done. And I showed you a number of microphotographs of them.
So I would place, this is a different topic. I don't want to get too off course, but...
Well, you've gone way off course already. I wanted to get started by understanding just how far are you going to entrench yourself on this. And you gave up the virus argument immediately. And now you're saying that you can prove viruses don't exist. I guarantee you cannot.
Well, nobody has described to me how they're made.
Well, okay, you being ignorant of a subject is not the same thing as proving it false.
Okay, how is a virus made? Depends on whether it's an RNA virus or a DNA virus. If it's a DNA virus, it's made by replicating DNA. And if it has a protein coating, of course, producing the protein to make the coating. And the parts come together through natural affinities. If it is an RNA virus, then the RNA gets transcribed into DNA, and the DNA gets inserted into the DNA of a cell. That DNA then gets transcribed back into RNA, producing another virus. And again, if the virus has a protein coating or something like that, the other parts of the virus are produced from the DNA or the RNA, depending on the particular sequence. And those parts again will come together due to their natural affinities. If you just produce the parts for one virus in a cell, you're probably not going to get a virus. But if you produce, well, I guess technically speaking, if you've got the RNA or the DNA, you've technically already got a virus. But it's not going to function like the full form of the virus, is my point. So you basically got a crippled virus. But if you produce lots of those parts, the more parts you have, the better chance there is that the right parts are going to come together. And it's not purely random. These parts have a natural affinity to each other. They are attracted to each other. And again, this is something that's inherited. The particular structure works the way it does because it was inherited from ancestors that also had a structure that worked. Most likely a very similar structure that worked. And their ancestors also had a very similar structure that worked. If you go back far enough, sure, the structure can change quite a bit over enough generations.
Now, you made a comment in your video that if we ever discovered a griffin, we would find some way to fit it into the taxonomic tree. But that's not possible.
You just draw lines.
What?
You just draw lines on paper.
No, you don't.
Just draw lines on paper. Sure, then why not just draw lines on paper between, say, a pineapple and an elephant? Or between an oak tree and a giraffe? Yeah. No, it's not like that. Sure, an oak tree and a giraffe have things in common. They're both eukaryotes. But you don't just draw a line from a giraffe to an oak tree and say, okay, you know, they're related because there's a line between them. No, you have to establish that they're related and how they're related before you can draw those lines between them. The lines are drawn to indicate what has been found, not arbitrarily.
The eye evolved twice. It's called.
No, it evolved more than that. The eye evolved minimum of 6 times. I think more like 8 times. And if you get, depending on how you define it, it might be even more because there's microbes, single cellular protists that have eye spots that are also photosensitive. But in each of the cases, I mean, the eye proves the point as well because the eye doesn't develop the same way each time. Our eyes are most similar to, when I say our eyes, I mean the eyes of vertebrates, for example, are most similar to the eyes of mollusks, except that they're fundamentally reversed, so that they don't have the blind spot that we do. Their eyes are actually designed better than ours.
Wait. You say we have a blind spot.
Yes.
I know what you're talking about, but I can refute that. But go on.
No, you can't.
Okay. Let me say a few things about the blind spot there. Yes, human eyes, vertebrate eyes have a blind spot. Our brains are blind to that blind spot. Instead of noticing that there's a blind spot there, instead of it being an obvious blind spot, that blind spot is actually hidden from us, which is not particularly advantageous, but obviously it didn't hurt our ancestors enough to make them go extinct, or we wouldn't be here. So, there are tests you can do, and you can run a search on the internet on YouTube for testing your blind spot or something, and you can find videos that'll tell you about how far away to hold your screen from you and stuff. Now, of course, it's going to vary depending on the size of your screen. If you're using a cell phone with a test that was made for, a 17-inch monitor, not going to work out so well. But there are tests that you can do where you can actually manage to make something disappear visually because there is a blind spot. Now, when it disappears, it doesn't mean it's going to be filled with black, or with white, or with green, or with red, or with any other specific color, unless that's the color in the background of that area, because that's how the brain fills in that gap. The blind spot is filled with the color and the pattern of the surrounding area. The brain treats it like everything in that spot must be like everything around that spot. But it's still a blind spot. In fact, it's such a blind spot that we're even pretty much blind to the fact that we have a blind spot. And we've got one in each eye. They don't line up in the exact same spot. They don't line up with each other in the exact same place, which is helpful because that means when you've got both eyes open, the details missed by one eye can be picked up by the other eye. But if you've only got one eye, that blind spot is just blind.
So with a blind spot, right, there is a blind spot, but it's not a black circle, right? It's not poor design because it works just fine.
It is poor design.
Its poor design is compensated for.
If it was a black
It's
circle,
not,
and every set of eyes, in every lineage, every independent evolution of those eyes has evolved a new and unique way of doing it. They never did the same thing twice.
Well,
the closest you've got is that vertebrate eyes and mollusk eyes are vaguely similar, except fundamentally reversed. Theirs are designed better than ours.
No, it's not. You said design, by the way, but it's not better.
Yes, because it's incidental design.
Yeah, but it's not better or worse.
Designed by nature.
Yes, it is, because they don't have the blind spot, and so there's another aptitude that they don't
How
have.
many people notice the blind spot?
What?
Hawks, how many people notice the blind spot? Hawks can see a rat on the ground from miles away.
Yeah, that we don't notice the blind spot. Yes, I get that. But it still matters that the mollusks don't have a blind spot to account for, and what you're still missing is that all of the other lineages that independently developed eyes went by entirely different means. Trilobite eyes are completely different than insect eyes, for example.
And bird eyes are quite a bit different than mammal eyes. I think that's also quite worth noting, since he mentioned the hawk's eye. Bird's eyes tend to have multiple focal lengths for seeing, basically for being able to enlarge things that are far away, to zoom in on them almost like a pair of binoculars. And so yeah, they can see a mouse from quite a long distance, but they can't see a mouse with their blind spot. If the mouse ends up in the hawk's blind spot in one eye, that eye is not going to see that mouse. Of course, it doesn't mean the other eye isn't going to see it. If it's a one-eyed hawk, I suppose then it might miss it completely. But it's a small blind spot. Again, it's not a particularly frequently fatal thing. Yeah, it's a detriment, but it's a small one. Even so, a better design would be to not have that blind spot at all.
Okay, so we mentioned that mammals cannot have feathers. And you said, why would mammals need feathers? They don't fly. But bats fly. Bats fly and they don't have feathers.
Yeah, so you got insects and birds and bats.
Right, and they don't have feathers either. And pterosaurs fly and they don't have feathers because they're not part of the dinosaur lineage where feathers began. And so descendants of dinosaurs can have feathers, but only them, and not anything else.
Okay, yeah, descent with modification. Nobody's saying that evolution doesn't make sense, though. I never said evolution doesn't make superficial sense.
Okay.
I'm saying it's ambiguous.
Where do you have a problem with it?
That you're saying it's a fact.
It is a fact. We can demonstrate it. We can prove it. It's been directly observed and documented dozens of times. Every possible experiment we've done has been vindicated. So what is the problem?
Well, I'm saying that
the National Academy of Science identifies evolution as a fact, as well as a theory.
Well, there's three different meanings to evolution. There's colloquial evolution.
No, there isn't.
Evolution is the accumulation of change. Biological evolution is the accumulation of change in biology. There are specific descriptions of exactly how biology evolves. And a biological theory of evolution, of course, is a theory. But biological evolution is a fact. Any theory of anything is a theory. That doesn't mean the thing that it's a theory of is a theory. A theory of gravity is a theory. Gravity isn't a theory. It's a language problem, I think. And I notice this happens. Aaron, if you're hearing this, you said something to the effect of that evolution is a theory, but it's also a fact. I would clarify that and say no, evolution is not a theory. A theory of evolution is a theory. Evolution is a process, and that process actually happens. That is a fact. So, yeah, means basically the same thing, but I do think the wording is important because a lot of times misunderstandings can be avoided with a slight change in wording.
When I use evolution, I'm talking about only biological evolution, descent with inherent genetic modification, also translated as allelic frequencies and reproductive populations over time.
Yeah. Okay, so
That is a theory of biodiversity.
So there's two ambiguous arguments. Either A, there's limits to it, or B, there's no limits to it.
But obviously he recognized by this point that evolution does happen. Now he's trying to narrow it down exactly in what way it happens, or in what forms it may or may not happen. I've seen this so many times before. This is a stage people go through when they're denying evolution, and then they realize that by denying evolution, they're basically denying pretty much everything they know, because pretty much everything they know evolves. So it's just a matter of another step from there, to go from recognizing that, yeah, evolution happens, might still have some limits, to being able to frame exactly what realistic limits there might be on evolution. Like, for example, the limitation that dogs will never evolve into skyscrapers. Just not going to happen. Yeah, that's a limit. Now, dogs will never evolve into non-dogs either, but that doesn't mean that non-dogs couldn't evolve into dogs. And apparently they did. Kent Hovind, I believe it was, had made some sort of a statement about the limitation of sizes of dogs, and trying to say that, you know, like a dog couldn't evolve into something the size of an elephant. Actually, they could, but not in their present form, and neither did elephants. Elephants didn't evolve into something the size of the elephant, but the shape of their smaller ancestors. They evolved into something the size of an elephant and the shape of an elephant. More to the point, they evolved into something the size of an elephant that was structurally able to withstand the weight of an elephant. Same thing goes for certain large dinosaurs that, you know, any large animal has to have a structure that can survive being that large. So there's nothing really stopping dogs from evolving into something that large, evolution-wise. There is probably, of course, the fact that there isn't a real big demand for elephant-sized dogs, so nobody's trying to breed them. But if somebody really wanted to, they probably could, over time, evolve, guide the evolution of some large breed of dogs to opt for a stockier large build rather than a slender large build, and end up with a dog the size of an elephant. They could also guide the evolution in the direction of something shaped kind of like a giraffe to make a very, very tall dog. Given enough time, given enough generations, and a large enough population for enough mutations to happen in, something along the same general lines probably would happen if guided in that direction, regardless of whether it's being guided by humans or by nature.
Okay, so it's evolution either way.
Yeah, but there are so many varieties of grapes, varieties of
Right.
giraffes.
We've evolved many different varieties of grapes.
Okay, let's go with that. Varieties of grapes. Just as one example. If you take a dozen varieties of grapes and you separate them, isolate them from each other genetically, say, for example, grow each one on an island far from any of the others, with no other varieties of grapes on that particular island, so they can't interbreed with the other varieties. Given enough time, they will evolve enough that they wouldn't be able to interbreed with those other varieties, even if they had the opportunity to. That would mean they're no longer just different varieties of the same species. They are then different species. And there's no reason really why, if that continued long enough, they couldn't evolve into something that doesn't even resemble grapes. Just a matter of enough changes. And that something that doesn't even resemble grapes, if one lineage evolved towards something that didn't even resemble grapes and another lineage evolved towards something that didn't even resemble grapes, they're most likely also not going to resemble each other all that terribly much. Because with that much change, drastically changing from what they used to look like, they're not likely to have gone in the same direction, unless the factors that guided their evolution were very similar factors.
So speciation, then, is a macroevolutionary change. Speciation is not microevolution.
So macroevolution is speciation, but speciation isn't macroevolution.
Why not? Yes, it is.
So why don't you just call it speciation?
Speciation is the first level of macroevolution.
The speciation is what caused bacteria to man evolution.
What could possibly make you think that humans are a species of bacteria? If a bacterium speciates, how is that going to be a human? I mean, seriously. No, that's not how it works. Sure, if you want to say speciation repeatedly, then that pretty much sums it up. If it's speciation after speciation after speciation after speciation. But you know what? It doesn't even have to involve speciation in that sense. I mean, sure, that many changes, there's going to be some species changes along the way. But they don't ever have to necessarily diverge. That much change could just plain add up. That's all it is the accumulation of change. Humans accumulated different changes from their early eukaryotic ancestors than spruce trees did. Humans acquired different changes. The ancestors of humans, I should say, acquired different changes than the ancestors of coral did. They evolved different because they accumulated different changes. But there is no speciation event that turns a bacterium into a human being. Or that turns a bacterium into a fruit fly, for that matter. That's just not the way it works. That would not be a speciation event. That would be a miracle.
Show me one instance where speciation has changed kind, or changed...
I can't show you what never existed.
Speciation having changed kind. Okay. Well, let's see. Humans are of the human kind, if you want to call that a kind. The human species would be a different kind than the species that we evolved from that was not human. I mean, when can you ever have speciation that doesn't result in a different kind? What they don't result in is a different created kind. They result in a different evolved kind. It doesn't even require speciation for that. Any variety could be considered a new evolved kind. Any variation that came about through the accumulation of change.
You can create what I've said all evolution is descent with inherent genetic modification. So everything that ever evolved at any level, microevolution, macroevolution, doesn't matter. It's a modified version of whatever its ancestors are. So everything I can show you that has been documented is a modified version of whatever its ancestors are, according to the evolutionary law of monophyly.
That's woo.
How is it woo?
Because macroevolution outside of speciation has never been observed.
You looked it up yourself on your own video. You cited a bunch of different cases of macroevolution. You said it was word salad because you didn't understand it, and I'm glad you admitted that at least you didn't understand it, but that just because it's too scientific and too educated for you to understand doesn't mean it's woo. Woo is when you make shit up yourself that you don't have any basis for, like that you can disprove that there are viruses, or that you can disprove the blind spot of the eye, which of course you can't do either one.
Something about that word salad, I'd like to make a comment on that. Having learned to read at a very young age, and having had an affinity for rather technical books early on, something I learned a long time ago is that if you read stuff that's above your level in any sense, your level tends to go up. If somebody is having trouble understanding something because there's too much science in it or too much technical stuff in it, rather than dismissing it as it's word salad, I would suggest reading more of it until it starts to make sense. Because obviously, if there are scientists out there earning a living coming up with the stuff and writing it down in detail, there's got to be some sense behind it. Whether a particular person sees the sense behind it or not. Now, it doesn't mean it's necessarily all correct, but if you want to find the flaws in it, don't count the fact that you can't understand it as a flaw. Learn to understand it. Look it over carefully. Find any flaws in it you can. And feel free to call the scientists out on any flaws that you do find in it, if you can manage to get a hold of them, or just to point it out publicly. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Scientists make mistakes like everybody else. And the good ones are not only not afraid to admit it, but look forward to finding out when it's happened, so they can correct themselves.
Nothing can ever become fundamentally different than its parents are, ever. That's the law of monophylity that I've repeated to you at no less than a half a dozen times.
Yeah, but I keep trying to tell you that you're operating off of theories, that this speculation...
You understand what a theory is. Let's just get into that, since this is the argument that I hate most among creationists, because it is the most deliberate lie. Creationists know what a theory is, but they deliberately misuse it. So, you ever heard of atomic theory?
Yeah, it's a black box.
What is atomic theory?
It's a black box. You can't...
No, it's not a black box. Atomic theory explains how atoms work. It explains how atoms function, how atoms react to different things, and exactly why they react the way they do. There's still some not quite known about that, but the scientists aren't hiding it. It's just stuff that they don't know yet, and they're still working on learning. There's no black box there. There's nothing being hidden. Nothing's been sealed away for you to not be able to look at. Also, I want to point out that a distinction should be made between a theory, a model, and an interpretation. A particular theory, a field of study about a particular subject, about how something works, may have many models inside of it, may have many different ways of looking at it. Those models don't necessarily have to reflect reality. They have to work. They have to serve a purpose. They have to function. That's what the models are for. Now, interpretations are usually an attempt to find a way to get those models to fit reality, to look at one of the models in such a way that you can match it up with reality. And those interpretations don't necessarily fit reality either. They try, but the facts fit reality. The collected data comes from reality.
So populations do evolve, not individuals.
Populations evolve, yes. So like one good analogy that actually works pretty well is the evolution of language. So we know that Latin, for example, is the basis for Romanian, French, Spanish, and then from Spanish we get Portuguese. So we have a second generation of Portuguese basically being derived from Spanish. And then also from Latin we get Italian. Now in the case of Spanish, Latin, and Romanian, these are a form of cladogenesis, which is we have a new variant arising in a population, right? You have a population that's moved away to France or Romania or Spain, and they develop this unique language slowly over time. There was never a first guy walking around a bunch of Latin speakers who suddenly speaks French. We know that there was a slow transition. We know that if you read documents that were written 1,500 years ago, in Spain, you will find that it's not quite Spanish, but yet it's neither is it entirely Latin anymore. It's in a transitional state. You accept that happens.
The languages evolve?
Yes.
Yes, you're arguing from analogy and equivocating language.
No, it's not equivocating. Languages have evolved. Again, if we go back to a simple basic definition of evolution, not of biological evolution, but of evolution. That evolution is the process of change accumulating or being accumulated. Languages go through that.
You're not getting the law of monophyly that can never be something fundamentally different than its parents were.
Okay,
it's
so
always
what's the
going to be a
counter-argument?
modified version of whatever its parents were.
So what's the counter argument to your analogy with language?
What counter argument? What do you mean?
Do you know the counter argument?
Are you going to tell me that? Are you going to tell me about the Tower of Babel?
No, I'm not.
I have no idea what he means by a counter argument in this case. I'm lost. Just saying.
I don't know anything about that. I'm saying that there's an analogy for evolution, but there's also an analogy in another model. Just because you have an analogy in your model doesn't mean there's not an analogy in this model.
Give me another model. What other model is there?
So you're saying that red, you've seen that picture with red and it evolves into blue?
This picture? Yeah, I made it. Long time ago. I'm assuming this is the picture you mean. Although there could be something else, because anytime, you can look at a rainbow and you can see the evolution of red to blue or blue to red, depending on which direction you look at it, because evolution does not have to happen over time. It can happen over any variable. Like from the top of the rainbow to the bottom of the rainbow, or the bottom of the rainbow to the top of the rainbow. In this case, it happens over the course of a paragraph. And I don't know if this is clear enough to see on the video, so I'm going to read the thing off. We can all agree, save for the severely colorblind, that this text is red. Next line says we can also similarly agree that this text is blue. Now, paragraph starting out in a red text says if we have red text and decide to change it by just a small amount, the change might be barely noticeable, but still a very small change. This we will call our microevolution. Every word up to now can be considered red, with very minute changes in the hue. If I keep typing long enough, would anyone be able to tell me, just by looking, at which word or letter is this post no longer red, but actually purple or blue? All this microevolution keeps occurring in the text, with its tiny changes in hue. But ultimately, I end up with a completely different color. It's actually the difference between what one would consider red and what one would consider purple, or a whole new species in this analogy, which is macroevolution. Now, I'm going to stop here and clarify that this is an analogy for macroevolution in biology. This is macroevolution. It's not an analogy of macroevolution. It's an analogy of biological macroevolution. In this case, it's macroevolution of a color, from one recognizable color to another recognizable color, as opposed to from one recognizable color to another variety of the same recognizable color, something we would call by the same name. And that really is what it comes down to, is our identification of it. I'll try to pick up where I left off. Let's see. See, the common misunderstanding is that macroevolution means a dog being the direct offspring of some other different canine-like species, or even more stupidly, a cat coming from a dog. Well, that's not what macroevolution is. There's really only one distinction between microevolution and macroevolution, and it's the same distinction between their prefixes, micro and macro. Just like if something is microscopic or if something is macroscopic. Microscopic usually requires a microscope to see it because it's so small, but macroscopic are things large enough to be seen by the common human eye. However, things of both sizes are completely visible and plainly exist. And there are many things in the universe between both general sizes. So as you read this, can you tell me the first word here that is blue and not purple? After all, every change in color since the first word in this paragraph has only microevolved from the color next to it. But we've managed to macroevolve through two colors. This hopefully will illustrate how it's illogical to believe that macroevolution does not happen, even given time for enough microevolution to occur. So tell me, what was the first purple word in the block of text above? What was the first blue word? Remember, if macroevolution simply cannot happen, then you're saying the words you're reading now are still red. I want to point out that while this is showing the evolution of colors from one color to another, they're always going to be colors. I mean, sure, we could evolve the different hues into different shades. We could we could make small changes in the color until maybe the blue became black and the black became gray and the gray became white. Of course, black will never be gray and gray will never be white. Blue will never be black. But that doesn't mean that you can't make small changes to get from one to another. And that's all microevolution is. It's just small changes that accumulate. Macroevolution is just enough microevolution to be more noticeable, to add up to something larger, more substantial. But you'll never have, for example, in a case like this where you've got colors evolving, where you have slight changes in color, you're never going to have a point where red becomes 37, or where blue becomes a cow, or where green gradually evolves into a cardboard box. There are limitations. But when people make up limitations and claim that certain limitations are there without substantiating their claims, be skeptical about it, because a lot of the things they're claiming are simply not true. For example, the idea that because cats don't give birth to dogs, dogs therefore couldn't have evolved from something other than dogs, is just ridiculous. Sure, dogs didn't evolve from cats. Those are contemporary species with a common ancestor. But dogs did evolve from an ancestor of cats, and cats did evolve from an ancestor of dogs. That's what it means to have a common ancestor.
Consciousness is eternal, wherever that is.
Why?
Because it's not in the brain.
Why?
It
The
doesn't.
consciousness is by definition
In
in
the
the
brain.
brain. Yes, it is by definition in the brain.
It
So
resides in the
you
brain.
can't have a model if all you
It's
have are
produced
empty
by the
assertions
brain.
that are false to start with. You have
So-
to have something that is demonstrably true. You have to be able to verify that there's some truth to what you're saying. You can't start with a false premise.
All right, so consciousness resides in the brain. Are you out with me here? It
Yes.
resides in the brain. Is
Yes.
it produced
It
by
is
the brain?
produced by
Yes.
the brain.
All right, where's your scientific evidence that shows that?
Neurology?
Yeah.
Daniel
Yeah.
Dennett,
There we go.
the most famous philosopher in the world, said that the mind does not exist in one part of the brain, that there is not a single place that you could point to in the brain that shows where the mind is,
But
that the mind is
consciousness
actually
does.
a product of the entirety of the brain, a conglomeration or cacophony, if you will.
I'm not talking about the mind. I'm talking about consciousness.
Well,
Reticular
then that
cortex,
is what you're talking
brain
about, because that's
stem.
what the mind is.
So what part
Actually-
of the brain has consciousness? Is it the neurons?
Maybe I'm misspeaking, but to my understanding, consciousness is not quite synonymous with the mind. It's more of a function of the mind. And the seat of consciousness would be the reticular cortex, as far as I know, unless neurology has found some new evidence to the contrary. But yeah, basically consciousness is produced by the brain stem. If you have a functioning brain stem, you've got enough of a brain to have consciousness. Even if the rest of the mind is basically shot, even if you're completely off your rocker, if your reticular cortex is in working order, you've got consciousness. A thinking entity can react to their surroundings as something in those surroundings. In order to do that, they basically have to be able to process that they are something in their surroundings, and the simplest brains can do that.
You think that consciousness comes from the
But we
brain?
can prove that consciousness
Because
comes from the brain, yes.
consciousness is produced by the
Versus
brain.
your notion
Setting me up.
that consciousness does not come from the brain, and you don't have
From
any
or
evidence
through?
of that.
Is it from the brain or through the brain?
It's from the brain. The brain generates the mind, which is the consciousness that you're talking about. And you want to pretend that consciousness is somehow independent of the brain. Where is your evidence for that?
It's a model, just
You
like
don't have a model.
That's not a
You have
model.
to have evidence
It's
before
a
you have a
claim.
model. What is your evidence?
my model explains the data equally.
You don't have a model. You have to have evidence before you can have a model. What is your evidence?
We're getting there. Your model, right, is from the brain. My model is through the brain. What's your evidence that it is from the brain?
As I just
not
explained,
a model.
neurology, and every neurologist will agree with this, that you can impede the brain, you can cut out pieces of the brain and impair the function of the mind. And you're saying that the mind comes through the brain somehow, I guess like it's some kind of a receiver or antenna, in which case it wouldn't matter what damage you did to the brain. As long as you left part of it open, the rest of it would still receive, even if it was staticky. So what evidence do you have to face the evidence I have against you?
Well, I'm not claiming mine is a fact.
Well, yes, you are, because you're claiming that yours is a model.
I'm saying they're equal, ambiguous models.
No, a functional neural network is something that's demonstratable. Your claim that consciousness is going through the brain still leaves the question of where it's coming from. You don't have a model for where it's coming from. If you throw out the fact that it's coming from the brain and just say it's coming through the brain. From what? From where? Take a look at neural networks in biology, because that's exactly what neurons connect themselves into. They make themselves into a neural network. The functionality of that neural network is the functionality of the brain. That functionality of the brain is what generates the mind that we think with. including the part of the mind that recognizes a self, and including the part of the mind that recognizes other than self. In other words, including the consciousness.
I keep giving you the floor to explain your model, and then you keep trying to push the burden of proof back onto me to get me to explain something. You're the one supposed to be explaining your position.
I'm trying to stay on topic here. We're talking about consciousness going through the brain.
On topic would be me explaining evolution to you. That was the topic of this conversation. You have changed that every opportunity you could to anything else that you could.
Okay,
I'm just going along for the ride while you keep changing subjects and moving goalposts.
All right, we'll talk about evolution.
Your evidence for your model.
All right, so we'll go back to evolution if you want, but I'm saying that consciousness is through the brain, not from the brain. Now,
I'm saying, what is your evidence for that?
So what's it from? The tooth fairy?
The same evidence as you have for your...
Okay, so I have neurology showing...
I have neurology.
No, you don't have that, because you don't have anything that indicates that something is traveling through the brain.
You don't have anything from the brain.
What we have is evidence showing that the brain is producing the mind, and that damage to different parts of the brain will affect different parts of the mind in a predictable way.
I'm saying consciousness. Yes, the brain produces the mind. Where does the consciousness come from?
Which is the same thing as a mind in this case.
No, it's not. Consciousness just sees. Consciousness just observes.
Okay, consciousness just observes. Okay, so when you impair the visual sensors in a cockroach, then its consciousness loses its ability to see. And that would be evidence supporting me and not you. What evidence do you have supporting you?
It supports me too.
No, it doesn't.
No, it really doesn't. You got to listen to what Aron just said. If you take away a cockroach's eyesight, then that cockroach can't see. And if it's not coming from the brain, if it's coming from somewhere else and going through the brain, then impairing the cockroach's eyesight shouldn't keep the consciousness from observing. It shouldn't need the eyes to do that, because the eyes are connected to the cockroach's brain, not to the cockroach's consciousness. Whatever exactly you think that is.
Can evolution explain the evolution of a butterfly from bacteria to butterfly?
Yes.
Bacteria are not eukaryotes. Aron knows that. Through endosymbiosis, we can get from a bacterium or from bacteria-like life forms to a eukaryote. From a single cellular eukaryote, yes, you can evolve a multicellular butterfly. Step by step, of course. The single cellular eukaryote, the early primitive single cellular eukaryote, is not going to simply give birth to an adult butterfly, or for that matter, to lay a butterfly egg. Doesn't work that way.
Now, what is your alternate model to explain that?
That butterflies have always been butterflies.
Butterflies tend to have been caterpillars and eggs before they were butterflies. Now, if you want to talk about a particular species of butterfly, sure, that species of butterfly was always that species of butterfly for as long as that species was around. But its ancestors were not all that species. Its closest ancestors would have been that species. And the closest ancestors to those would have been their species also. But go back far enough, and they're not the same species anymore. Because that's how accumulating change works.
So for 70 billion years ago, butterflies were butterflies?
I wasn't alive then, but there's no evidence that shows that there would ever be anything different.
There absolutely is plenty of substantial evidence to show that they would be otherwise, yes.
Now let me clarify that, and Aron, you can correct me if I clarify this wrong, because you know your meaning better than I would. But butterflies came from the ancestors of butterflies. Of course, butterflies in their adult form have always been butterflies in their adult form. Caterpillars have always been caterpillars. Eggs have always been eggs. But butterfly eggs are not the only kind of eggs. And the eggs that butterflies come from evolved from the eggs that other creatures came from that were the ancestors of butterflies. The question is, what do those eggs develop into as an adult? It's been eggs all along, for a really long way back. But each generation, each thing that grows out of one of those eggs, grows according to its own DNA. And the ancestors of butterflies could only have had butterfly DNA as far back as that DNA was able to produce something that would still fit the description of a butterfly. Any ancestors before that weren't producing butterfly eggs. They were producing eggs for non-butterfly ancestors of butterflies. And yeah, we know that happens because it's still happening now. Evolution hasn't stopped.
You said that the further back in time you go, organisms will become more simple.
If you had a time machine and you could travel back in time and take an organism with you, it's not going to become more simple just because you traveled back in time. You want to build a car? There's a whole lot of parts that go into that. But you're going to have to start simple before you can even have those parts. You're going to have the materials, the metals, the plastic, all the other things that you need to make the parts. And the parts are going to have to be made before you can make a car out of it. By the time you got a completed car, it's a whole lot less simple than it started out. And the same thing goes for evolving a butterfly, or evolving a bear, or evolving a bird. Yeah, their ancestors were a lot simpler, on the average. And inevitably, if you go back far enough, every living thing around now had simpler ancestors at some point in their ancestry. I mean, there's basically no life that we know of on this planet that isn't rather complex at this point. And that makes sense, because life that was too simple, life that didn't have evolutionary advantages that could allow it to compete with other modern life, wouldn't last very long in today's world. If abiogenesis were to produce something the equivalent of a very simple primitive bacterium, chances are, before it even had a chance to multiply once, it would be eaten by some fungus or bacteria or some other life form and never get a chance to reproduce. If it did manage to reproduce, it probably wouldn't be very long before all of its descendants had been eaten. If it got lucky and it managed to evolve some defenses and survive long enough, then okay, then we could have a brand new kind of life evolving. But there have already been many kinds of life that have come and gone. The vast majority of life on this planet has already gone extinct. And the vast majority of life that will evolve will probably also go extinct.
Give me some reason to think that what you say might be true.
All right, so you said that the further back in time you go, the simpler the organisms are. Is that true?
Generally.
Simpler and more similar, yes.
Okay, so is that a fact that things evolve from more simple things? Because of
yes. But not, it doesn't have to be, because you don't have to always have increasing complexity. As a matter of fact, in the fossil record, we have a number of things that go decreasing complexity. Sometimes that happens. It is not a rule. But I'm still looking for your evidence that butterflies were always, that 70 billion years ago, butterflies were already butterflies. Before there was an Earth, there were already butterflies.
Well, the burden of proof is on the one that's saying that butterflies won't produce butterflies in the future or in the past.
And who's saying that? Where do you get that idea from? I mean, okay, yeah, I know there are creationists out there that claim that's what evolution is. Is that what happened? Is you got fooled by one of them into thinking that's what evolution is? Because it's not. Yeah, the descendants of butterflies, by definition, will always be butterflies. They might end up looking like something that you would never call a butterfly because you know what a butterfly looks like and that ain't it. But by definition, they will still be butterflies. So I don't know what you're getting at, because evolution is not what you seem to be making it out to be. It's just the accumulation of change. If, for example, a butterfly were to, say, have an offspring that didn't grow wings, that didn't even go into the pupa form, that their offspring only ever grew up to be a caterpillar, that was its adult form, it never went into the pupa stage, never grew wings, would you still call that a butterfly? I don't think most people would. But technically, it is the descendant of a butterfly. It is therefore a butterfly. In that sense, a butterfly caterpillar is also a butterfly. It's not the butterfly form. It's a little of a complicated language thing. This is kind of like the difference between, as I mentioned earlier, between a carnivore and a carnivoran. Like the difference between being a vertebrate and being a member of vertebrata. Again, you know, if you have a descendant of vertebrata that has no vertebrae, it's still vertebrata. It never grows out of that. It's no longer a vertebrate, but it's still vertebrata. And yeah, and that, like I said, that gets into a language problem, because in some sense you could say, well, vertebrate is the English name of vertebrata. Vertebrata is the Latin name for it. And so you could say, yeah, it is a vertebrate in that sense. And this comes down to different senses of the same word. Whatever monophyletic clade a life form is in, and whatever clade that clade is a member of, all descendants of that clade will also be members of its parent clade. In fact, all of the descendants of that clade will always be members of all of their ancestral clades. I don't think that's really all that hard of a concept, but you seem to keep getting it backward. Now, however, the descendant clades are members of the ancestral clades, but not the other way around. The ancestral clades are not members of their descendant clades. The clade itself is not a descendant. The ancestral clade itself is not a descendant of a descendant clade. The descendant clade is the descendant. Members of the descendant clade are also members of the ancestral clade, and therefore members of the ancestral clade are also members of the descendant clade. But the clade itself, ancestral clades are not descended from descendant clades. So you've got to get your directions straight. Learn your forward and backward. I know it's not an easy thing, but I have trouble with things like, recognizing that if somebody says, there's a meeting on Sunday, they don't mean the day before yesterday. I can get that, but no, seriously, nothing about evolution suggests what you're trying to say it suggests.
Okay, so are you the one saying that butterflies won't produce butterflies?
Butterflies probably always produce butterflies, and always will produce butterflies.
Always have produced butterflies? Since you said butterflies were always, you're the one saying butterflies were always butterflies, right?
Yeah,
so the burden of proof, therefore, is on you to show that there was a time before there was a planet, or 70 billion years ago, or whatever it was, 11 trillion years ago, butterflies are already butterflies. What is your evidence of that?
I wasn't alive that long ago.
So what evidence do you
That's
have
evidence that you weren't alive
to give me any reason to think that anything you say even might be true? Allow me to step out of my bubble. Give me a reason to think that you're not absolutely full of bullshit.
All right, how did butterflies evolve from bacteria?
Butterflies evolved from their ancestors through a series of accumulated changes, the same way as everything else that evolved has evolved. And that includes butterflies, cockroaches, humans, the English language, the French language, the Spanish language, British culture, African culture, the various African cultures, the Judeo-Christian religions, the heathenistic religions, the pagan religions, everything that has evolved that same way, by accumulating changes. That's how evolution works. If you want to know what steps a particular life form went through in its evolution, look it up. There are people who spend a lot of time and effort on figuring out the answers to that very question amongst millions of different life forms. You think there's one person that has them all memorized? I don't. I don't think there is such a person. Nor do I think that it's impossible that there may be some errors in the in the connections that have been made, but they are made meticulously. They are made very, very carefully. It's not just drawing lines on a piece of paper and connecting two things arbitrarily to each other. It's not even close to that. In fact, the process of figuring out the natural history of biological evolution is itself an evolutionary process. Consider that.
So you're taking the evidence, which is the evidence that you're asking for, and you're making it your own. The evidence that you're taking is actually my evidence.
The evidence that butterflies did not always exist is evidence that butterflies always existed, is what you're telling me.
I think, Aaron, what he's telling you is that he agrees with you. Although I don't think he realizes that's what he's telling you. He's basically saying that the evidence that you presented is evidence for what he's trying to say, which obviously must mean that he agrees with you because it's evidence for what you've been saying all along. Which kind of makes sense because, after all, I mean, he was arguing that, basically, to paraphrase, he doesn't think a non-butterfly, or he doesn't think a butterfly can evolve into a non-butterfly. Of course, he also doesn't seem to think that a non-butterfly can evolve into a butterfly. And there's where the difference comes in. That you and I both agree that a non-butterfly could and did evolve into a butterfly. He thinks that's woo. But I think he's in agreement with us that a butterfly won't evolve into a non-butterfly. So at least that's a step. He does admit that evolution is happening, and he recognizes at least some of how it works. Maybe in time he'll get the rest of it as well.
I don't know. I wasn't there that long ago, but I know that butterflies produce
butterflies. We have butterflies in the fossil record going quite a long way back, hundreds of millions of years, and then we have roughly, as I said, I'm trying to remember correctly, but roughly, I want to say 360 million years ago, we have the first insects. and we don't have butterflies yet. But so that's the evidence.
There was no
what?
There was no first insect, by the way.
Okay, so there was no first insect. So there were a plethora of insects. We have an empty assertion from you with no evidence to back it up. Please give me the evidence that insects, a multiplicity of insects, always existed. What is that evidence?
You took my evidence. All your evidence is my evidence.
Okay, the evidence that I have is that no insects appear in the fossil record prior to 360 million years ago, and you're going to say that that's evidence that insects always existed.
No, that's my evidence.
So my evidence that insects didn't exist in the fossil record until 360 million years ago is somehow your evidence that insects did exist prior to 360 million years ago.
Well, the fact that insects showed up in your model and insects showed up in my model is ambiguous evidence.
So you want to say that insects already existed before they showed up in the fossil record. So
I wasn't there then, though.
Right, and neither was I, but it doesn't matter.
I don't think he's following you, Aaron. I really don't. Because you just asked him if that was his evidence that insects always existed, and he said, no, that's my evidence. Which means he's basically saying that no, he doesn't think insects always existed. And whatever it is that he does think, which he has not made clear, he thinks that the evidence that you're presenting is evidence for that, whatever it is. So there again, like I said, maybe he's figuring it out little by little. I wouldn't get my hopes up for this to happen very quickly, but I've seen slower, and I've seen slower manage to learn. Just saying.
The evidence is the same evidence as your evidence.
So the evidence that they didn't show up until the evolutionary timeline, where first insects appeared 360 million years ago, and that butterflies appeared some substantial period of point after that, is somehow your evidence that insects existed prior to the formation of the Earth.
Yes.
Okay. And there he just said, yes, insects pre-existed. I think I see where he's coming from. Hold on, wait a minute. Aaron, I might be wrong here. I could be way wrong. I'm not saying this makes any sense at all. But he did allude to thinking that humans existed before human bodies, at least as individuals, that, you know, that we're, I don't know, floating out there in the ether or whatever, as disembodied life. And then we get a body, and our mind works through the brain, whatever that's supposed to mean. Maybe he's thinking the same thing about butterflies. Maybe he just thinks that all of life is just out there waiting to get a body. And that butterflies appearing at some point in time was, I don't know, a result of butterflies deciding to get bodies, maybe? Yeah, like I said, I ain't making sense out of it, but I think I'm understanding him better than I was. Just scary enough.
You want to argue that butterflies existed always, forever, in eternity. So you would have to produce a fact indicating that a butterfly existed prior to the evolution of insects on land. So what is that fact that implies that butterflies existed 400 or 500 or 600 million years ago?
Carbon or dating methods.
Carbon dating.
Or whatever method dating.
Carbon dating, which only goes up to about 50,000 years, and that's it. So carbon dating clearly does not provide any evidence for you. You don't even know what the hell you're talking about.
This, I don't know, but it seemed to me that basically what he's trying to do there is bluff his way through being completely lost. I mean, carbon dating? Did he really think that you're not going to know what that is and you're just going to go, oh, that's your evidence?
Why are you arguing with me?
I'm saying
why do you not want to understand what is really true? I can show you what's really true. You clearly don't want to know that. You want to believe something else.
You not understand
Why?
ambiguous evidence? Ambiguity in evidence?
Why do you insist that something be ambiguous? I'm showing that it's not.
You're saying
I'm showing that we can prove things clearly.
You're saying that butterflies showed up at a certain time, right?
Yes, and you're saying that they already existed prior to that. What fact indicates that butterflies existed prior to that? Give me that fact.
At the same time as you are.
What is the fact that indicates that butterflies existed prior to that?
I said butterflies showed up in my model at the same time as your model.
Right, but you want to argue against my model. You want to say that butterflies existed prior to that. So what fact?
For all I know, they could have.
What fact indicates that butterflies existed prior to that?
I said that's not necessarily what I'm proposing. I'm proposing that they could have existed.
You said butterflies always existed. All insects always existed.
I think
that means that 700 gazillion years ago, there were already insects. All insects. All the insects we have now were already there gazillions of years ago. What fact?
I think he's trying to change his position there and back down.
I'm not promoting that. I'm saying.
So you don't have a fact. Therefore, you don't have evidence. Therefore, you can't have a model. You don't have a mechanism. You have nothing at all. You are wasting my time.
I'm saying butterflies could have always existed, or they
couldn't have. And again, in order to say that something is possible, you have to have a precedent or a parallel or a verified phenomenon indicating that such a possibility exists.
I think he's basically saying he doesn't know. And I think he's also kind of trying to backtrack and take back something that he said without really admitting that he's taking it back. I'm just saying.
You don't have that.
Ambiguous.
Do you even know what that word means?
It can go my way or it can go your way.
He doesn't know what it means, but he likes it.
You're talking about evidence, which means not ambiguous.
The evidence is ambiguous.
No, it's not. The evidence would be not ambiguous. It would clearly indicate that you could produce a fossil from say 3.5 billion years ago, when all that we know about microfossils is that we have bacteria and nothing else, and you could produce a fossil dating from that time of butterflies, and then would be able to say, hey, you know what, you have a fact in support of your bullshit argument. But you don't, and you know that you don't, so you're just wasting my time. I'm done with you.
All right.
I'm done with you. I don't like deliberate dishonesty. I will surrender any amount of patience. If you're just stupid and that's the only problem you have, I'll do everything I can to help you. But you are clearly worse than that. You are dishonest. Goodbye.
Yeah, I really think toward the end there he was actually trying to back down and maybe correct himself somewhat. Not really sure. It's hard to tell. Hopefully by the time I'm done editing this, it won't be too terribly long, and it'll be something short enough and worthwhile enough for you to go through, and maybe, just maybe, I might have something in here that could be of some benefit to you. I'm not sure, but I'd like to try. Be helpful if I can.